Deep in the wilderness, where cell towers can't reach and the nearest neighbor is 20 miles away, Marcus CHEN, 34, stands before a collapsed cabin that hasn't seen human care in decades. Rotting timber beams sag toward the forest floor. Moss creeps through broken windows. 30 years of weather have reduced what was once someone's dream into a monument to abandonment. Marcus sets down his weathered backpack and pulls out a small handsaw. The autumn morning is crisp, filled with the sound of wind through pine needles and distant bird calls. No traffic, no deadlines, no digital distractions. Just a man, some basic tools, and a structure begging for resurrection. He measures a fallen beam with careful hands, the kind of attention that comes from someone who has learned that good work takes time. This isn't about speed or efficiency. This is about doing something right, something lasting, something meaningful. What Marcus doesn't know yet is how this simple restoration will completely transform not just the cabin, but his understanding of what it means to build a life worth living. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus had been walking for 3 days when he stumbled upon the rusted mailbox, tilting at an impossible angle. Its red paint faded to the color of dried blood. The name Reynolds was barely visible through layers of weather damage, but it was enough to tell him that someone had once called this remote corner of the wilderness home. 6 months earlier, Marcus CHEN had been debugging code at 3 in the morning, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and the blue glow of multiple monitors. Senior software engineer at a tech startup that promised to revolutionize social media engagement. The irony wasn't lost on him now. He'd spent years helping people connect digitally while losing his own connection to everything that mattered. The panic attacks started small, a tightness in his chest during particularly stressful deployments. Then came the sleepless nights, the inability to focus, the growing sense that his life was speeding past him in a blur of deadlines and performance metrics. His doctor called it burnout. His therapist suggested a vacation. His girlfriend suggested he needed professional help. So Marcus had done what any reasonable person would do. He'd quit his job, broken up with his girlfriend, and started hiking. Not weekend warrior hiking, but serious, week-long treks into places where the only sounds were wind and water, and his own breathing. The Cascade Wilderness had been calling to him for months. Maps spread across his apartment floor showed vast sections of green, with no roads, no trails, no human infrastructure, just mountains and forests and the promise of solitude. He'd planned for a 5-day loop, but on day 3, following what might have been an old logging road, he discovered this mailbox, standing sentinel over nothing but overgrown forest. Curiosity had pulled him deeper into the woods, following faint traces of what had once been a driveway. Fallen logs blocked the path every few hundred yards, forcing him to climb over or bushwhack around obstacles that time and weather had thrown across the route. The forest was reclaiming this place with patient determination. When he finally saw the cabin, or what remained of it, Marcus felt something shift inside his chest. Not panic this time, but recognition. Here was something that had been built with intention, inhabited with purpose, then abandoned to the slow decay of neglect. It felt like looking in a mirror, the structure listed heavily to one side, its roof partially collapsed under the weight of a fallen pine. What had once been a front porch now served as a nursery for young fir trees pushing up through rotted planking. The door hung askew on rusted hinges, revealing glimpses of an interior choked with debris and vegetation. But underneath the damage, Marcus could see the bones of something beautiful. The foundation stones, though displaced in places, showed careful selection and placement. The remaining wall logs were hefty and straight, chosen by someone who understood the difference between building for a season and building for generations. Even the collapsed roof displayed craftsmanship in its beam construction and joint work. Marcus dropped his pack and began a careful exploration of the ruins. In what had been the main room, he found evidence of the life that had flourished here. A cast-iron wood stove, its surface orange with rust but still solid. Mason jars lined a shelf that somehow remained level despite the building's tilt. A rocking chair sat in the corner, its wood weathered grey but structurally sound. The mailbox had told him the family name, but these artifacts spoke of daily routines. Evening meals, quiet moments by the fire. Someone had loved this place enough to carry heavy stoves and delicate glassware 20 miles through wilderness. Someone had rocked in that chair, watching seasons change through windows that now framed only sky. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the clearing, Marcus found himself imagining the work it would take to restore this place. Not the quick fixes and temporary solutions of his digital world, but real work with hand tools and natural materials. Work that would take months, not minutes. Work that would leave him with something tangible, something that could last. That evening, camped beside a creek 50 yards from the cabin, Marcus made a decision that would have seemed impossible during his cubicle days. He would stay. He would learn. He would bring this place back to life, one careful day at a time. The mailbox had led him here, but something deeper would keep him. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he'd found something worth building. Morning came with the sound of a woodpecker hammering against a dead snag somewhere in the canopy above. Marcus woke to filtered sunlight and the realization that he hadn't checked his phone in over 12 hours. More surprising still, he didn't care. After a breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee brewed over his camp stove, Marcus began his detailed assessment of the cabin. He approached it like debugging code, systematic, methodical, looking for the root causes behind visible problems. But instead of tracking down software errors, he was cataloging decades of weather damage and structural decay. The foundation told the first story. Fieldstone and river rock, carefully fitted without mortar, had shifted over the years as frost and tree roots worked their patient destruction. The southeast corner had dropped nearly 6 inches, creating the dramatic list that threatened the entire structure. Several foundation stones had tumbled completely free, leaving gaps that invited further settling. Working his way up the structure, Marcus found that the log walls themselves were in better condition than they appeared. The outer surfaces were grey and weathered, scarred by woodpecker holes and insect damage, but when he scraped away the surface layer with his knife, the wood underneath was still sound. Someone had chosen their timber well, old-growth fir and cedar that had been properly seasoned before construction. The roof was a different story entirely. The fallen pine had punched through the shake covering and snapped 2 of the main support beams. Water had been pouring into the interior for years, creating a cascade of rot that started at the break and spread downward through wall plates and floor joists. The damage was extensive but not terminal, like a severe wound that could heal with proper care. Inside the debris-choked interior, Marcus made his most important discovery. Tucked into a mason jar, wedged behind the cast-iron stove, he found a set of hand-drawn blueprints, their edges brown with age but their lines still clear. Someone had taken the time to carefully plan this structure, noting dimensions, joint details, and material specifications in precise handwriting. The plans revealed the cabin's original scope, not just the single room he saw now, but a full homestead with attached workshop, root cellar, and covered walkway to an outdoor kitchen. The fallen tree had destroyed only the main living space. The other elements had never been built or had been dismantled and moved elsewhere. More importantly, the blueprints showed him how the original builder had approached each challenge. Foundation details that accounted for frost heave. Wall construction that shed water while allowing the structure to breathe. Roof angles calculated for snow loads and prevailing winds. This wasn't amateur work. Whoever had built this place understood both engineering principles and local conditions. Marcus spread the plans across the one level surface he could find, the top of an old wooden crate, and began making his own notes in the margins. He sketched the current damage, marked which elements could be salvaged, and started developing a restoration sequence that would rebuild structural integrity before addressing cosmetic concerns. His tool inventory was laughably inadequate for the job ahead. A folding saw meant for clearing hiking trails, a small hammer designed for tent stakes, a multi-tool with pliers that might handle small hardware. No power tools, no heavy equipment, no way to transport materials except what he could carry on foot. But the blueprint suggested a different approach. Notes in the margins referenced local materials and found timber. Sketches showed joinery techniques that relied more on careful fitting than metal fasteners. This cabin had been built by someone working with similar limitations, using hand tools and forest resources to create something lasting. As afternoon settled into evening, Marcus walked the perimeter of the clearing, seeing it now through the eyes of the original builder. Deadfall timber that could be milled into lumber, a seasonal creek that could power simple machinery, stone outcroppings that could provide foundation material. The forest wasn't just the setting for this project, it was the hardware store. That night, by lamplight, Marcus began sketching his own restoration plan. Not the quick fixes of his digital world, but a methodical rebuilding that would honor both the original vision and the patient lessons of the wilderness. The blueprints had shown him more than construction details. They'd revealed a different way of thinking about time, materials, and the relationship between human ambition and natural resources. For the first time since leaving the city, Marcus felt like he had a real plan. The work began at dawn, with the sound of Marcus's folding saw cutting through decades of accumulated brush. Blackberry vines had claimed the cabin's perimeter, their thorny canes weaving through foundation stones and up rotting wall logs like green barbed wire. Each cut released the sweet scent of crushed leaves and the musty smell of decaying wood. By mid-morning, Marcus had cleared enough vegetation to expose the foundation's true condition. What he found carved into the southeast cornerstone stopped him cold. J.R. 1987, etched in neat block letters, the grooves still sharp despite 30-plus years of weather. James Reynolds, presumably, marking the moment when his dream became reality. The personal touch transformed the restoration from academic exercise to something deeper. This wasn't just rebuilding a structure. It was honoring the vision of someone who had carried stones through 20 miles of wilderness, who had carefully fitted each piece with the hope that it would last. The initials spoke of pride, permanence, and the human need to leave a mark on the world. Marcus ran his fingers over the carved letters, feeling the deliberate care in each stroke. He imagined Reynolds working by lamplight, taking time from the urgent business of construction to record this moment. It was the kind of attention to detail that separated building from craftsmanship, function from art. The foundation repair would require him to honor that same attention. Each displaced stone needed to be evaluated, cleaned, and reset with the precision of a puzzle solver. The original builder had selected stones, not just for their load-bearing capacity, but for how their shapes and surfaces fit together. Flat sides faced inward for stability. Rough sides faced out for character. Larger stones anchored corners and openings. Smaller stones filled gaps and leveled courses. Working alone meant every stone had to be moved by hand. Marcus quickly learned to read the weight of fieldstone by sight, to identify pieces he could handle versus those that would require leverage and patience. A 4-foot steel bar, salvaged from debris inside the cabin, became his primary tool for shifting the heavier foundation stones back into position. The physical demands surprised him. 8 hours of coding had never prepared him for this kind of sustained exertion. His hands, soft from years of keyboard work, developed blisters within the first hour. His back, accustomed to ergonomic chairs, protested each bend and lift. By evening, every muscle ached with the honest fatigue of meaningful work, but there was satisfaction in the ache. Each replaced stone stayed where he put it, solid and permanent in a way that software deployments never were. No rollbacks or patches here, just careful work that would either stand for decades or fail spectacularly. The stakes were different, the timeline longer, the feedback immediate and honest. The cornerstone with Reynolds' initials became his benchmark. As he worked to restore the foundations level and square, Marcus used that marked stone as his reference point. If Reynolds had taken time to mark his achievement, then Marcus would take time to honor it properly. Each adjustment brought the foundation closer to its original geometry. Each correction restored a little more of the builder's intended vision. Working by headlamp after dark, Marcus made his final adjustments to the southeast corner. The foundation level showed true for the first time in decades. The cornerstone sat exactly where Reynolds had placed it, supporting the same load, serving the same purpose, but now properly anchored against future settling. As he cleaned stone dust from his hands at the creek, Marcus realized something had shifted in his relationship with time. In the software world, projects measured success in days or weeks. Features shipped, users responded, metrics updated in real time. But foundation work operated on a different scale entirely. This repair might last 50 years, serving purposes and supporting dreams he couldn't imagine. The carved initials reminded him that building something lasting wasn't just about technical competence. It was about vision, patience, and the willingness to invest effort in outcomes you might never see. Reynolds had carved those letters not for recognition, but for permanence. A signature on work that was meant to outlast the man who created it. Marcus found himself understanding why someone would carry stones through 20 miles of wilderness. Not for convenience or efficiency, but for the satisfaction of building something real, something solid. Something that would honor both the builder's skill and the forest's generosity. The foundation was level. Tomorrow, he could start thinking about walls. The morning brought rain, steady and persistent, drumming against the tarp Marcus had stretched over his sleeping area. From the dry space beneath the canopy, he watched water cascade through the cabin's broken roof, pooling on the debris-covered floor in patterns that spoke of years of similar storms. It was perfect weather for indoor work. Marcus pulled on his rain jacket and entered the cabin properly for the first time, picking his way carefully through fallen timbers and accumulated forest litter. The damage looked worse from the inside. Decades of weather had turned the floor into a garden of moss and small ferns, while water stains painted abstract murals on every surface. But beneath the decay, Marcus began to find treasures. A leather-bound journal, wrapped in oiled cloth and tucked inside a cedar box, had survived the years of exposure. The first page bore the same careful handwriting he'd seen on the blueprints. James Reynolds, Cabin Construction Notes, started April 15, 1987. Marcus carried the journal to his tarp shelter and spent the rainy morning reading by LED light. Page after page revealed not just construction details, but the story of a man pursuing a dream with methodical determination. Reynolds had documented everything: timber selection, joint-cutting techniques, seasonal weather patterns, even philosophical observations about the relationship between building and living. May 3rd, learn today that cedar splits clean when you read the grain properly. Like everything else here, the forest teaches you if you're willing to listen. June 12th, foundation complete. Took longer than planned, but worth doing right. A building is only as good as what holds it up. August 7th, first wall log set. Amazing how much difference proper tools make. Found an old wood plane in Grandpa's things that cuts shavings thin as paper. The entries painted a picture of solitary craftsmanship mixed with deep satisfaction. Reynolds wrote about the daily rhythms of physical work, the pleasure of solving problems with hand tools and patience, the growing sense of connection to the land that supported his efforts. There were setbacks, rain that delayed progress, tools that broke at critical moments, techniques that failed and had to be reworked. But running through every entry was a sense of purpose that Marcus recognized from his own recent experience. This wasn't just about building shelter, it was about proving something to himself, about creating something lasting with his own hands, about finding meaning in work that connected him to both the natural world and traditional skills. The journal's final entry, dated September 23, 1987, was shorter than the others. Roof complete just before first snow. Ready for winter? This place feels like home. Marcus closed the journal, understanding now why the cabin had been abandoned despite its obvious quality. Family emergencies, job changes, health problems, any number of circumstances could pull someone away from a remote homestead. The journal told the story of creation, but not the story of departure. More importantly, the journal provided practical guidance for his own restoration work. Reynolds had documented which local trees made the best building material, how to season lumber without proper facilities, where to find clay suitable for chinking between logs. He'd noted the seasonal patterns that determined when different types of work could be accomplished, the tools that proved essential versus those that remained unused. Reading through the construction notes was like receiving mentorship from across the decades. Reynolds had faced every challenge that Marcus would encounter, had solved every problem through trial and patient error. The journal was a gift from builder to builder, a passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. As the rain continued through the afternoon, Marcus began his own journal, documenting his assessment of the current damage and his plans for restoration. He sketched the sections that could be salvaged, noted which techniques from Reynolds' journal seemed most applicable to his situation, and began developing a timeline that respected both the seasonal constraints and his own learning curve. By evening, the rain had stopped and Marcus could see stars through breaks in the cloud cover. He'd spent the day learning from Reynolds' experience, but tomorrow he would begin making his own. The journal had shown him that building something lasting required more than technical skill. It demanded patience, flexibility, and the willingness to let the work teach you as much as you taught it. The cedar box had protected Reynolds' knowledge for 30 years, waiting for someone who needed those lessons. Marcus felt the responsibility of that trust, the obligation to honor both the original, builder's vision, and the forest's generous cooperation. In making it real, the next morning brought Marcus face to face with the difference between reading about craftsmanship and practicing it. Among Reynolds's tools, carefully wrapped in oiled leather, he'd found a handmade wood plane that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of maple. The tool felt substantial in his hands, its weight perfectly balanced, its blade honed to mirror brightness. According to the journal, Reynolds had inherited the plane from his grandfather and considered it his most valuable possession. A good plane in skilled hands can true any surface, smooth any joint, solve any fitting problem, one entry read. But it takes time to learn its language. Marcus was about to discover just how much time. His first attempt at using the plane ended with a gouged mess and nearly sliced fingertips. The blade caught in the wood grain, tearing out chunks instead of producing the gossamer shavings Reynolds had described. The tool that had seemed so elegant in still photographs bucked and fought in Marcus's inexperienced hands like a wild animal. By noon, he'd managed to produce exactly 3 serviceable board feet of lumber from a piece of salvaged cedar, along with a pile of wood chips that looked like the aftermath of a beaver attack. His hands were cramped from gripping the tool too tightly. His shoulders ached from fighting the blade's tendency to dive too deep, and his pride had taken a thorough beating. But something about the struggle felt right. This wasn't the instant gratification of digital work, where problems could be Googled and solutions copied from Stack Overflow. The plane demanded that he develop a relationship with it, that he learn to read wood grain and adjust his technique accordingly. Each mistake taught him something about pressure, angle, or grain direction that no amount of reading could convey. The afternoon brought incremental progress. Marcus learned to relax his grip, to let the tool's weight do the work instead of forcing it. He discovered that different types of wood responded to different approaches. Cedar required a light touch and shallow passes, while fir could handle more aggressive cutting. His movements became less frantic, more rhythmic, almost meditative. By evening, he'd successfully dimensioned enough lumber to repair one of the cabin's damaged wall logs. The boards weren't perfect. They showed tool marks and slight variations in thickness that would have horrified his perfectionist coding instincts. But they were true and square, and fit together with satisfying precision. More importantly, Marcus had begun to understand what Reynolds meant about the relationship between builder and tools. The plane wasn't just a piece of metal and wood. It was an extension of his intentions, a translator between vision and reality. Learning to use it properly wasn't about mastering technique, but about developing sensitivity to feedback, patience with imperfection, and respect for the materials being shaped. That night, cleaning and oiling the plane, according to Reynolds' detailed maintenance notes, Marcus reflected on how different this learning process felt from acquiring digital skills. Software tutorials promise quick results and universal solutions. But traditional craftsmanship operated on a different principle entirely. Each tool, each piece of wood, each problem required individual attention and adaptive thinking. The frustrations were real. His hands bore fresh blisters from gripping unfamiliar tools. His back ached from hunching over workbenches improvised from sawhorses and salvaged planks. Simple tasks that should have taken minutes stretched into hours as he wrestled with techniques that master craftsmen made look effortless. But beneath the physical discomfort and wounded pride, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years of software development: the satisfaction of making something real with his own hands. When he ran his fingers across a board planed smooth and true, he could feel the difference between adequate and excellent. When he fitted two pieces of wood together with tight, precise joints, the success was tangible and immediate. The handmade plane was teaching him more than woodworking technique. It was showing him the value of patience, the importance of developing sensitivity to subtle feedback, and the deep satisfaction that comes from mastering skills that connect him to generations of craftsmen who had faced similar challenges with similar tools. Reynolds had been right about the tool's language. Marcus was beginning to understand its vocabulary, even if he couldn't yet speak it fluently. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new frustrations, and hopefully new competencies in the slow but satisfying process of learning to build things that would last. The sound of the massive pine falling had echoed through the valley like thunder, followed by the crash of smaller trees caught in its path. Marcus stood beside the felled giant, awed by its size and humbled by the responsibility of turning it into lumber. The tree had stood for over a century, growing slowly in the thin soil and short summers of the high country, and now it would become part of the cabin's resurrection. Reynolds' journal had been specific about timber selection. Choose trees that have grown slowly. Fast growth makes weak wood. Look for tight grain, small knots, straight trunks. The forest will tell you which trees are ready to serve a new purpose. This pine had been marked by lightning years ago, its top broken and healing slowly. It was still alive but no longer thriving, making it an ethical choice for harvest. Marcus had spent 2 days with his small folding saw, working from multiple angles to drop the tree safely away from the cabin and his camp. Now came the real work, breaking down the massive trunk into usable lumber. Without a sawmill or power tools, Marcus faced the same challenge that had confronted builders for thousands of years: how to split a round log into flat boards using only hand tools and patient effort. The process began with reading the wood itself. Marcus walked the length of the fallen trunk, studying the bark patterns and checking for hidden defects. Lightning scars, frost cracks, and insect damage all told stories about how the wood would behave when split. A good tree could yield dozens of boards. A problem tree could waste days of effort and leave him with nothing but firewood. This pine showed promise. The trunk ran straight for 30 feet before the first major branch, and the bark revealed the tight, even growth rings that Reynolds had valued. Using his camp axe and steel wedges salvaged from the cabin ruins, Marcus began the slow process of opening the log along its natural grain lines. Each strike of the axe sent vibrations through the trunk, and Marcus learned to read those vibrations like a language. A solid thunk meant the wedge was biting properly. A higher-pitched ring suggested he was fighting the grain instead of following it. Dull impacts warned of knots or other obstacles that would require patience and alternative approaches. The first split took 3 hours and yielded 2 half-logs, each still massive but now showing their inner structure. The wood was beautiful, cream-colored heartwood, surrounded by amber sapwood, with grain so straight it looked like it had been drawn with a ruler. This was the kind of timber that built cathedrals and sailing ships, patient wood that had grown slowly and would serve faithfully for generations. As the day progressed, Marcus fell into the rhythm of the work. Position the wedge, strike with controlled force, read the wood's response, adjust and continue. His shoulders burned and his hands cramped, but each split revealed more of the tree's hidden structure. By evening, he'd broken the main trunk into 8 manageable sections, each destined for specific purposes in the restoration. The work was hypnotic in its repetition. Strike, evaluate, reposition, strike again. No distractions, no multitasking, just the immediate feedback of steel meeting wood and the gradual revelation of useful lumber. Marcus found his mind settling into a state of focused calm that he'd never experienced during his coding days. Each piece of lumber represented hours of patient work, but also connected him to the tree's century of growth and the forest's generous abundance. This wasn't just processing raw materials. It was participating in the cycle of forest renewal, taking what was offered while respecting what remained. As darkness fell, Marcus surveyed his day's work by headlamp. The fallen giant had been transformed into neat stacks of timber, each piece split along natural grain lines and showing the beautiful patterns that only patient work could reveal. Tomorrow, he would begin the process of shaping these rough timbers into the precise dimensions needed for cabin construction. The tree had given up its forest life to serve a new purpose, and Marcus felt the weight of that gift. Every board would carry the story of patient growth and careful harvest. Every joint would honor both the tree's contribution and the craftsman's skill in shaping it properly. 3 weeks into the project, Marcus faced his first major construction milestone, raising the cabin's first new wall. The damaged logs had been carefully removed, the foundation leveled and reinforced, and fresh timber shaped to match the original dimensions. Now came the test of whether his growing skills could translate into structural reality. Working without modern levels or measuring tools, Marcus had learned to rely on simpler methods that builders had used for centuries. A pine cone suspended on a length of string became his plumb line, its weight always pointing true toward Earth's center. The simple tool, improvised from forest materials, proved more reliable than any digital device. It couldn't run out of batteries, couldn't be damaged by moisture, and provided instant feedback about whether his work was running true. The first log placement required absolute precision. Too high, and subsequent courses would compound the error. Too low, and gaps would appear that would be difficult to correct later. Marcus positioned and repositioned the massive timber, checking it against his improvised plumb line, until it sat exactly where the original builder had intended. Lifting the logs into position alone presented challenges that Reynolds' journal had touched on but not fully explained. A single wall log weighed close to 200 pounds and had to be maneuvered precisely into notched joints while maintaining perfect alignment. Marcus learned to use leverage instead of brute force, employing salvaged timbers as levers and fulcrums to shift massive pieces with controlled movements. The work demanded a different kind of problem-solving than his software background had taught him. In coding, problems had elegant solutions that could be researched, copied, and optimized. But moving heavy timber required improvisation, spatial thinking, and the willingness to try multiple approaches until physics and determination aligned. Each log presented unique challenges. Natural variations in diameter meant that joints had to be individually fitted. Slight bows or twists required careful orientation to maintain straight walls. Knots and grain patterns affected how each piece would settle and shrink over time. Marcus found himself developing an intuitive understanding of wood behavior that no manual could teach. The plumb line became his constant companion and most trusted advisor. Before any major adjustment, he consulted its verdict. After every log placement, he verified alignment against its steady truth. The simple tool connected him to generations of builders who had raised barns and churches and homes using the same reliable principle. Gravity always points toward the Earth's center, making it the perfect reference for vertical accuracy. By noon, 3 courses of logs were in place, their joints fitted with the precision that only handwork could achieve. The wall was beginning to suggest the structure it would become: solid, permanent, properly proportioned. Marcus stepped back to check his progress against the plumb line one more time, feeling satisfaction that ran deeper than any software deployment had ever provided. The afternoon brought the challenge of maintaining square corners while working alone. With no helper to hold one end while he adjusted the other, Marcus had to devise systems for temporarily supporting logs while he checked and rechecked their positioning. Wooden wedges, salvaged boards, and carefully placed rocks became his assistants in the slow process of assembly. Each joint required individual attention. The traditional notching method that Reynolds had used demanded precise cutting with hand tools, creating interlocking connections that would tighten over time as the wood seasoned. Marcus found himself taking pride in joints that fit so tightly they required persuasion from a wooden mallet to seat properly. As evening approached, the first wall stood complete from foundation to plate level. 4 courses of hand-fitted logs, each one precisely positioned and securely joined to its neighbors. The structure looked solid enough to stand for decades, which was exactly what Marcus intended, testing the wall's stability by pushing against it. Marcus felt the satisfaction of work that would outlast the worker. The logs had been growing for a century, and now they would serve for another century, as part of a building that honored both their natural properties and the builder's developing skills. The pine-cone plumb line hung motionless beside the completed wall, confirming what Marcus could feel in his bones. The work was true, square, and built to last. Tomorrow he would begin the second wall, but tonight he could rest, knowing that his skills were growing along with the cabin. The storm arrived without warning, turning a peaceful morning into a battle between human ambition and natural force. Marcus woke to the sound of wind roaring through the forest canopy and rain hammering against his tarp shelter with tropical intensity. Within minutes, what had been a dry campsite became a network of streams carrying runoff toward the valley below. His first concern was the partially completed cabin. 2 walls stood proud and solid, but the lack of a roof made them vulnerable to driving rain and potential structural damage. Marcus pulled on his rain gear and fought his way through horizontal precipitation. To assess the situation, the walls themselves were holding firm. The traditional log construction that had seemed so primitive, compared to modern framing, proved its worth in extreme conditions. Water streamed down the log faces, but didn't penetrate the tight joints. The foundation, leveled with such care weeks earlier, channeled runoff away from the structure exactly as Reynolds had designed it. But Marcus's construction materials and tools were scattered across the worksite, exposed to weather that could ruin weeks of careful preparation. Freshly split lumber, still green and vulnerable to checking, needed immediate protection. Hand tools that had served faithfully for decades could be destroyed by a single night of exposure to driving rain. Working in conditions that made every task twice as difficult, Marcus began the urgent process of protecting his progress. A large tarp, originally intended as emergency shelter, became a roof over the stacked lumber. Smaller tarps covered tool areas and material stockpiles. Everything that couldn't be waterproofed had to be moved to the marginal shelter of dense forest canopy, the makeshift tarp shelter that had served as his primary protection. Quickly proved inadequate against the storm's fury. Wind-driven rain found every gap and seam, turning his sleeping area into a shallow lake. By noon, Marcus faced the reality that his current shelter arrangements wouldn't survive the night. Reynolds's journal had mentioned a winter shelter, a small, weatherproof structure built during the cabin's construction to house tools and provide emergency refuge. Marcus had seen remnants of what might have been such a building on the backside of the clearing, but hadn't investigated thoroughly. Now, with water rising around his ankles, exploration became necessity, fighting through vegetation made treacherous by mud and flowing water. Marcus found the ruins of what had indeed been a tool shed and emergency shelter. The roof had collapsed years ago, but the walls were solid stone and mortar, built to withstand exactly this kind of weather. More importantly, a large blue tarp had been stretched corner to corner inside the ruins, creating a surprisingly dry space beneath. Someone else had been here recently, within the last year. Judging by the tarp's condition and the neat arrangement of salvaged materials underneath, hiking boots, emergency food supplies, and basic camping gear suggested that other wilderness travelers had discovered this shelter and maintained it as a mutual aid station. Marcus added his own contributions to the shelter while taking advantage of its protection. He repositioned some of the gear to make room for his sleeping area, then spent the afternoon organizing tools and materials in the dry space. The storm raged overhead, but inside the stone walls he found the peace needed to plan his next moves. The enforced break from construction work gave him time to study Reynolds' journal more carefully. The storm entries were particularly relevant now, notes about seasonal weather patterns, techniques for working in difficult conditions, and the psychological challenges of extended periods when outdoor work became impossible. October storms can last 3 days, one entry read. Better to wait them out than fight them. The forest sets its own schedule, and smart builders learn to work with it rather than against it. As evening approached, the storm showed no signs of abating. Marcus settled into the improvised shelter, grateful for the protection and oddly content with the forced pause in his project. The tarp overhead drummed with rain, but the sound was comforting rather than threatening. Evidence of nature's power, but also of human ingenuity in finding ways to coexist. With that power, the storm was teaching him patience and respect for natural forces beyond his control. Tomorrow might bring clear skies and resumed progress, or it might bring another day of waiting. Either way, Marcus was learning to measure success not just by forward momentum, but by adaptability and resilience in the face of challenges he couldn't anticipate or control. The morning after the storm brought crystalline air and the kind of light that made every dewdrop look like a tiny lens. Marcus emerged from his makeshift shelter to find the forest transformed, washed clean, vibrant green, alive with the sound of water moving through 1,000 hidden channels toward the valley below. More importantly, the cabin walls had survived their first major test. Watermarks on the logs showed how high the driving rain had reached, but the joints remained tight and the structure stood exactly as he'd left it. The foundation drainage that Reynolds had engineered 30 years earlier had performed flawlessly, channeling storm runoff away from the building site. But the storm had also revealed a critical flaw in Marcus's construction sequence. The walls stood solid and true, but without window openings, the interior remained a dark cave that would be difficult to work in and impossible to properly evaluate. Light was essential for the precision work ahead, joint cutting, interior framing, and the countless detailed tasks that would transform 4 walls into livable space. Marcus had been postponing window installation because it seemed like finish work, something to address after the basic structure was complete. But working by headlamp and flashlight during the storm had shown him that natural light wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity for quality craftsmanship. The original window frames had been damaged beyond repair when the roof collapsed, but the glass panes themselves told a different story. Carefully removed from their broken frames and cleaned of decades of accumulated grime, they proved to be remarkably intact. Some showed small chips and stress cracks, but most had survived their long abandonment with only surface scratches that patient polishing could minimize. Each pane represented a significant investment in the original construction. Getting manufactured glass to a remote wilderness cabin would have required careful transportation over 20 miles of rough terrain. Reynolds had clearly valued natural light enough to justify that expense and effort, and Marcus found himself respecting that priority more with each dark hour he spent working inside the windowless walls. The reclaimed glass became the starting point for Marcus's first major design challenge. Traditional window construction required precise joinery and careful sealing, skills at the edge of his developing abilities. But the alternative was months of working in artificial light, sacrificing the quality and satisfaction that proper illumination would provide. Reynolds' journal included detailed notes about window installation, complete with sketches showing traditional techniques for creating weatherproof seals without modern materials. The method relied on careful wood preparation, precise fitting, and the use of natural materials like pine pitch and oakum for sealing gaps. Marcus began by creating window frames from the straightest, most stable lumber in his inventory. Each frame required 4 perfectly fitted joints, cut with hand tools and assembled without metal fasteners. The work demanded patience and precision. A single mistake in measurement or cutting would require starting over with new materials. The first frame took 3 days to complete, a humbling reminder of how much skill separated reading about joinery and actually executing it. But when the pieces finally came together, the joints tight and square, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction of work that would last for generations. Installing the reclaimed glass required even more care. Each pane had to be measured individually, then bedded in glazing compound made from pine pitch and charcoal dust. The traditional glazing technique created a flexible seal that would move with seasonal changes while maintaining weatherproof integrity. The moment when natural light first streamed through the completed window transformed the cabin's interior from cave to living space. Suddenly Marcus could see the grain patterns in the wall logs, the precise fit of his joints, the accumulation of wood shavings and sawdust that marked his progress. More importantly, he could envision the finished space, how furniture might be arranged, where the fireplace would cast its warmth, how the room would feel when filled with the golden light of morning or evening, working by natural light. Marcus found his craftsmanship improving immediately. Details that had been invisible by flashlight became obvious in daylight. Joints that had seemed adequate revealed gaps that needed attention. Tool marks that had been acceptable in artificial light called for additional smoothing. The reclaimed glass had given him more than illumination. It had provided perspective, literally and figuratively, on the work that lay ahead. 6 weeks into the project, Marcus faced the most technically demanding challenge of the restoration, rebuilding the roof system that would protect everything he'd accomplished so far. The fallen pine had destroyed not just the covering material, but the entire structural framework that supported it. Without a weatherproof roof, all his careful wall construction remained vulnerable to the next major storm. Reynolds' journal devoted more pages to roofing than any other single topic, reflecting both its complexity and its critical importance. A building is only as good as its roof, one entry emphasized. Everything else can be repaired or replaced, but roof failure destroys the entire investment. The traditional approach Reynolds had used relied on hand-split cedar shingles, each one individually crafted from straight-grained logs. Marcus had identified several suitable cedar trees on the property, casualties of past storms that had seasoned naturally while standing dead. The wood was perfect for splitting, dry, stable, and naturally resistant to weather and insects, but creating enough shingles to cover the entire roof represented hundreds of hours of repetitive, precise work. Each shingle had to be split to uniform thickness, shaped to shed water effectively, and sized to create overlapping courses that would turn even driving rain away. From the building interior, the splitting process began with selecting cedar, bolts, sections of trunk cut to shingle length and free of major defects. Using a combination of axe work and careful wedge placement, Marcus learned to read the wood's natural grain structure and split along those lines rather than fighting against them. The first shingle took him an hour to complete, a humbling reminder of how much skill separated adequate from excellent. The cedar wanted to split in its own patterns, and Marcus had to learn to work with those natural tendencies rather than imposing his own ideas about how the wood should behave. By the end of the first week, his production rate had improved dramatically. Muscle memory began to replace conscious thought as his hands learned to feel the wood's grain structure, and his tools found their natural rhythm. Each shingle still required individual attention, but the process became meditative rather than frustrating. The quality of his work improved alongside his speed. Early shingles showed obvious tool marks and irregular edges that would have created problems during installation. Later pieces emerged smooth and uniform, with the clean lines and precise tapers that characterized traditional craftsmanship at its best. Working under the forest canopy, surrounded by the sound of splitting wood and the scent of fresh cedar, Marcus found himself settling into a different relationship with time. The digital world had trained him to measure progress in minutes and hours, to expect visible results from every work session. But shingle making operated on a different scale entirely. Each day's work produced a neat stack of wooden tiles, individually insignificant, but collectively representing real progress toward a weatherproof building. The work was repetitive, but not monotonous. Each piece of wood presented unique challenges that required attention and adaptation. The precision demanded by traditional shingle making taught Marcus new levels of craftsmanship. Variations in thickness that seemed trivial would create problems when the shingles were installed in overlapping courses. Edges that weren't perfectly straight would leave gaps for water penetration. Tapers that varied from piece to piece would create an irregular appearance that marked the work as amateur rather than professional, but achieving that precision with hand tools required developing sensitivity that went far beyond technique. Marcus learned to feel minute variations in wood density, to hear the difference between clean splits and forced ones, to see grain patterns that predicted how each piece would behave under the blade. As autumn progressed and his shingle pile grew, Marcus understood why Reynolds had devoted so much journal space to this single task. The roof would be the most visible element of the finished building, the component that determined both its weather protection and its visual character. Rushing the work or accepting adequate instead of excellent would compromise everything that came after. The hand-split shingles represented more than roofing material. They embodied the patience, skill, and attention to detail that separated building from craftsmanship. Each piece carried the story of careful wood selection, patient splitting, and gradual skill development that characterized the entire restoration project. By the time Marcus had completed enough shingles for the full roof, winter was approaching, and his hands bore the calluses and small scars that marked him as someone who had learned to work with traditional tools and natural materials. The neat stacks of cedar shingles represented not just building materials, but proof of his transformation from digital worker to traditional craftsman. With exterior walls complete and windows installed, Marcus turned his attention to creating the interior spaces that would transform the cabin from shelter to home. The single most important element would be the fireplace, the heart that would provide warmth, light, and the psychological comfort that comes from gathering around an open flame. Reynolds had planned for a stone fireplace in the cabin's northwest corner, positioned to heat the main living space while creating a focal point for furniture arrangement. The original foundation showed where the hearth was meant to sit, and scattered riverstones around the property suggested the materials Reynolds had intended to use. Building a functional fireplace required knowledge that went far beyond Marcus's growing carpentry skills. The chimney had to draw properly, creating enough draft to pull smoke up and out while preventing downdrafts that would fill the room with fumes. The firebox needed proper proportions to burn efficiently. The hearth required fireproof materials and construction techniques that would contain the heat safely. Once again, Reynolds' journal provided crucial guidance. Detailed sketches showed the traditional proportions that ensured proper draw, firebox height, width, and depth ratios that had been refined over centuries of trial and error. Notes described the local clay deposits that could provide mortar for stone joints and the sand and gravel sources needed for concrete work. The first challenge was gathering suitable stone. Marcus spent 3 days exploring the creek beds and hillsides around the cabin, selecting pieces based on size, shape, and heat resistance. Sandstone and granite would handle the high temperatures of the firebox. Smooth river rocks would work for decorative elements. Flat stones would create stable courses and level surfaces. Each stone had to be moved by hand from its collection point to the cabin site. Pieces weighing 50 or 60 pounds required careful lifting and multiple rest stops during transport. The largest stones, foundation pieces and hearth elements needed improvised sleds and multiple trips to position properly. The construction process began with excavating a foundation that would support the fireplace's substantial weight. 3 feet down, Marcus hit bedrock, providing the solid base that masonry construction required. The foundation stones went in carefully, each one selected for its ability to distribute load and resist settling. Building the firebox walls required precision that tested every masonry skill Marcus had developed. Each stone had to be fitted individually, shaped with hammer and chisel to create tight joints and level courses. The mortar mixed from local clay had to be applied at exactly the right consistency. Too wet, and it wouldn't support the weight. Too dry, and it wouldn't bond properly. The most critical element was the fireplace throat, the narrow opening that connected the firebox to the chimney flue. Too large, and heat would escape without warming the room. Too small, and smoke would spill into the living space. Reynolds' notes specified exact dimensions based on firebox size, proportions that Marcus followed religiously. As the stonework rose course by course, the fireplace began to dominate the cabin's interior. What had been open space became defined by the massive masonry structure, creating natural areas for seating and storage. The hearth extended into the room, providing a platform for wood storage and a place to sit close to the fire's warmth. The chimney construction proved even more demanding than the firebox. Each course had to be perfectly plumb and level, with consistent flue dimensions from bottom to top. Working above head height, Marcus had to lift heavy stones into precise positions while maintaining the structural integrity of everything below. After 2 weeks of careful stonework, the fireplace stood complete from foundation to roofline. The proportions were exactly as Reynolds had planned, the joints tight and level, the overall appearance both functional and beautiful. But the real test would come with the first fire. Marcus gathered seasoned firewood and kindling, then lit a small test fire in the new firebox. Smoke rose cleanly through the flue, drawn by the proper proportions and careful construction. No downdrafts, no spillage into the room. Just the clean burn of well-designed masonry and the satisfying warmth of radiant heat. That evening, sitting beside his first real fire in the completed fireplace, Marcus felt the cabin transform from construction project to home. The dancing flames cast warm light on log walls and filled the space with the comfortable sounds of burning wood and settling stones. For the first time since beginning the restoration, he could imagine living here permanently. Day 78 brought Marcus face to face with the reality that shelter was only the beginning of self-sufficient living. The cabin now kept out wind and rain. The fireplace provided warmth and light, but he still depended entirely on supplies carried in from the outside world. True independence would require solving the fundamental challenge that had faced wilderness dwellers for millennia. Reliable access to clean water. Reynolds's journal included extensive notes about water sources and collection systems, revealing that the original builder had spent considerable effort solving this same problem. Hand-drawn maps showed the seasonal streams and springs within walking distance of the cabin, along with detailed observations about flow rates, water quality and reliability through different weather conditions. The most promising source lay 300 yards uphill from the cabin, a spring that bubbled up from rock ledges and fed a small creek that ran year-round. Marcus had been hauling water from this source since the project began. But carrying 5-gallon containers over rough terrain multiple times daily was exhausting and time-consuming. Reynolds had planned a more elegant solution, a hand-dug well positioned to intercept the underground flow that fed the spring. His notes described the traditional technique of following groundwater upstream to find where it approached closest to the surface, then digging down to create a reliable collection point. The well location required careful consideration of both water table depth and practical access from the cabin. Too close to the building, and contamination from human activities became a risk. Too far away, and daily water collection remained a burden. Reynolds had marked his intended spot with survey stakes that Marcus had initially mistaken for random debris. Digging began with a 4-foot circle outlined in the forest soil. The first few feet went quickly through topsoil and leaf litter, but soon Marcus encountered the rocky subsoil that characterized this mountain environment. Each shovelful had to be broken loose with a pick or pry bar, then lifted to ground level in increasingly heavy buckets. At 6 feet down, Marcus hit his first significant challenge, a layer of large stones that appeared to be glacial till left by ancient ice flows. Moving these rocks required rigging simple block and tackle systems from overhead tree branches, plus the patience to work around obstacles that couldn't be removed. But beneath the rock layer, the soil changed character dramatically. Instead of dry, compacted earth, Marcus found clay that stayed moist even during the recent dry spell. More encouraging still, small seeps began appearing in the well walls, clear evidence that he was approaching the water table that fed the uphill spring. The work became more technical as the well deepened. Proper construction required installing stone walls to prevent cave-ins and contamination from surface runoff. Each stone had to be selected for its ability to drain freely while providing structural support. The joints between stones needed to filter sediment without clogging or restricting water flow. At 12 feet down, Marcus struck what prospectors would have called pay dirt, a gravel layer shot through with clear, cold water that bubbled up from underground sources. The well began filling immediately, rising to a stable level about 8 feet below ground surface. But accessing that water still required solving mechanical problems that Reynolds had faced 30 years earlier. Hand-dug wells needed windlasses or other lifting systems to raise buckets from depth without contaminating the water supply. The traditional solution used a simple pulley mounted over the well opening, with a rope and bucket system that allowed one person to draw water efficiently. Marcus fashioned his windlass from salvaged materials, a straight pine log for the axle, carved wooden brackets to support the bearings, and a hand-forged crank handle that provided mechanical advantage for lifting full water buckets. The entire assembly had to be weatherproofed and positioned to prevent contamination while allowing easy access. The first successful water draw felt like a milestone equivalent to completing the roof or installing the fireplace. Clear, cold water rose from the earth through his own engineering, providing the foundation for genuine self-sufficiency. No more daily treks to distant springs, no more rationing water for cooking and cleaning. That evening, Marcus celebrated by cooking the first real meal in his restored cabin. Fresh trout from the nearby creek, wild greens gathered from the forest, and water drawn from his own well. The hand-dug well had connected him to the land in a fundamental way, making him a participant in the natural systems that sustained life rather than just a visitor passing through. With 90 days complete and only 30 remaining in his self-imposed timeline, Marcus entered the final phase of restoration, the countless small details that would transform a functional structure into a finished home. These weren't the dramatic milestones of wall raising or roof installation, but the quiet perfection of hardware, trim, and craftsmanship that separated adequate from excellent. The cabin's entrance had been functioning with a temporary arrangement of plywood and hinges salvaged from the ruins, adequate for keeping out weather, but hardly worthy of the craftsmanship visible in every other element of the restoration. A proper door required both artistic vision and technical precision. It would be the first thing visitors noticed and the element that welcomed or warned them about what lay beyond. Reynolds' notes included detailed sketches for traditional door construction, emphasizing both security and beauty. The design called for thick planks joined with traditional techniques that would remain tight and true through decades of seasonal movement. Most importantly, all hardware was to be crafted by hand from available materials rather than purchased from distant suppliers. Marcus began by selecting the finest lumber from his carefully hoarded stock, straight-grained cedar boards that had been air-drying for weeks under the protection of his work shelter. Each plank was examined for defects, measured for consistency, and marked for its position in the finished door. The joinery required techniques at the edge of Marcus's developing skills. Traditional mortise and tenon construction demanded precision that left no room for error. Joints had to fit tightly enough to remain solid for generations, but not so tightly that seasonal wood movement would cause splitting or binding. But the most challenging element proved to be the door latch, the simple mechanism that would secure the entrance while allowing easy access from either side. Store-bought hardware was obviously out of the question, and Reynolds's journal described a traditional solution that relied entirely on wood, leather, and simple metal components that could be forged from salvaged materials. The hand-carved door latch represented everything Marcus had learned about working with natural materials and traditional techniques. The mechanism required precise tolerances between moving parts, smooth surfaces that would operate reliably for years, and the kind of attention to detail that transformed functional hardware into folk art. Carving the latch. Components demanded tools and techniques that pushed beyond basic woodworking into the realm of fine craftsmanship. Each piece had to be shaped individually, fitted to its neighbors, and adjusted until the entire mechanism operated with the smooth precision of a Swiss watch. The latch bar itself came from a piece of seasoned oak, carved and sanded until it moved effortlessly through its wooden guides. The pivot points required careful drilling and fitting to ensure smooth operation without excessive wear. The lifting mechanism needed exact spring tension to engage reliably while remaining easy to operate. Marcus found himself working with tolerances measured in fractions of inches, adjusting and readjusting until every component functioned perfectly. This wasn't the forgiving work of rough carpentry, where small errors could be hidden or corrected. Door hardware demanded precision that would be visible and tested. Every time someone entered or left the building, the traditional latch string provided the final challenge, a simple leather cord that passed through the door to allow operation from outside. The hole had to be positioned exactly, sized properly to prevent binding, and sealed against weather without interfering with the mechanism's operation. Installation day arrived with the crisp air and golden light that marked autumn's transition toward winter. Marcus hung the completed door on hinges he'd forged from salvaged iron, adjusting it carefully until it swung true and seated properly against the weather stripping he'd carved from cedar strips. The moment when the hand-carved latch engaged for the first time felt like completion of more than just a door. It marked the end of the restoration's major construction phase and the beginning of something new. The cabin was now secure, weatherproof, and beautiful. Every element crafted with attention to detail that honored both the original builder's vision and Marcus's own growing understanding of traditional craftsmanship. Standing outside the completed entrance, Marcus realized that the hand-carved door latch represented more than functional hardware. It embodied the transformation from someone who consumed manufactured goods to someone who could create lasting beauty with his own hands. Every time he operated that latch, he would remember the patience, precision, and pride that had gone into its creation. Day 120 arrived with the kind of crisp autumn morning that made every breath visible and every surface touched with frost. Marcus stood where he had first encountered the collapsed cabin 4 months earlier, holding a before and after photograph that documented one of the most dramatic transformations he'd ever witnessed, and he had been both photographer and subject. The image in his hand showed the ruins as he'd found them, roof caved in, walls listing dangerously, vegetation reclaiming what human effort had once wrested from the wilderness. The structure had been a monument to abandonment, a reminder that even the most solid accomplishments eventually surrender to time and neglect. Now, the same location held a building that looked like it had been standing strong for decades. The walls rose plumb and true, their carefully fitted logs weathering to the silver grey that marked seasoned timber. The cedar shingle roof shed the morning's frost in perfect watercourses that spoke of proper pitch and expert installation. Smoke rose straight and clean from the chimney, evidence of a fire burning efficiently in the hearth he'd built with his own hands. But the most dramatic change wasn't captured in any photograph. It was visible in Marcus himself. The soft-handed software engineer who had stumbled upon this place 4 months earlier had been replaced by someone whose calloused hands moved confidently among hand tools, whose eye could read wood grain and stone structure, whose body had adapted to the rhythms of physical work and seasonal change. The transformation had been gradual enough that Marcus hadn't noticed it day by day, but the accumulated changes were undeniable. His shoulders had broadened from lifting heavy timbers and stones. His hands showed the permanent stains and small scars that marked someone who worked with traditional materials. Most importantly, his relationship with time had fundamentally shifted from the instant gratification of digital work to the patient satisfaction of projects that measured progress in seasons rather than sprints. The photograph also documented something less visible but equally important: the difference between restoration and renovation. Marcus could have rebuilt the cabin using modern materials and techniques, creating something faster, cheaper, and arguably more efficient. Instead, he had chosen to honor the original builder's methods and materials, learning traditional skills that connected him to centuries of craftsmanship. Every element of the restored cabin told the story of that choice. The hand-split shingles that would weather and age naturally, rather than failing catastrophically, like manufactured roofing. The mortise and tenon joints that would tighten over time, instead of loosening like modern fasteners. The stone fireplace that would serve for generations rather than decades. Walking through the completed building, Marcus inventoried not just the physical improvements, but the skills he'd acquired in the process. Timber framing, stone masonry, traditional joinery, water system engineering, roofing, glazing, each represented knowledge that would remain with him regardless of what projects lay ahead. The restoration had also taught him about the relationship between individual effort and lasting achievement. Every board he'd planned, every stone he'd fitted, every shingle he'd split represented hours of focused attention that could never be rushed or shortcut. The modern world's obsession with efficiency and speed had been replaced by an appreciation for thoroughness and permanence. Most surprisingly, the physical challenges had proved easier to master than the psychological ones. Learning to use hand tools and work with natural materials had been straightforward compared to developing the patience that quality craftsmanship demanded. The instant feedback loops of software development had trained him to expect immediate results. But traditional building operated on a completely different timeline. 4 months of patient work had produced something that would outlast its builder by decades, possibly generations. The cabin would shelter future occupants, provide refuge for travelers, and stand as evidence that careful craftsmanship could triumph over both time and neglect. As Marcus packed his few remaining possessions for the return to civilization, he realized that the photograph in his hand documented more than a building restoration. It captured a personal transformation that had been every bit as dramatic. The collapsed cabin had been rebuilt, but more importantly, the man who rebuilt it had discovered capabilities and satisfactions he'd never known he possessed. The restoration was complete, but the education would continue for the rest of his life. The letter arrived on day 122, carried by a hiker who had agreed to play postal service during Marcus's final days at the cabin. The return address showed his former employer's logo, and the weight suggested more than a simple forwarding notice. Marcus set it aside while he finished his morning coffee, reluctant to let the outside world intrude on these last quiet moments. When he finally opened the envelope, a formal job offer letter fell onto the pine table he'd crafted from salvaged lumber. Senior architect position, significant salary increase, stock options, comprehensive benefits package. Everything he'd thought he wanted, back when his life had been measured in deployment cycles and performance reviews. The timing felt deliberately orchestrated, as if the corporate world had sensed his vulnerability at this moment of transition. After 4 months of subsistence living and physical labor, the prospect of regular paychecks and climate-controlled offices carried undeniable appeal. Hot showers, reliable electricity, restaurants that didn't require catching your own dinner, comforts he'd almost forgotten existed. Marcus read through the offer details twice, calculating what the salary could buy in terms of convenience and security. A downtown apartment with city views, a reliable car to replace his aging pickup truck, the kind of lifestyle that his former colleagues would consider success. But as he sat in the cabin he'd rebuilt with his own hands, surrounded by evidence of what human patience and skill could accomplish, the offer felt like a voice from another life entirely. The person who would have been excited by stock options and corner offices had been replaced by someone who measured wealth in different terms entirely. The restored cabin around him represented a form of success that couldn't be quantified in salary, ranges, or benefit packages. Every wall log, every roof shingle, every stone in the fireplace testified to the satisfaction of creating something lasting with traditional skills and natural materials. The work had been difficult, often frustrating, but it had also been deeply meaningful in ways that debugging code had never approached. Marcus walked to the window and looked out at the forest that had provided materials, inspiration, and countless lessons about patience and adaptation. The trees operated on timescales that made human careers seem brief and insignificant. Some of the giants surrounding the cabin had been growing since before his country was founded, accumulating rings of growth through patient decades of seasonal cycles. The job offer represented a return to the world of quarterly earnings reports and annual performance reviews, where success was measured in metrics that reset every fiscal year. But the cabin restoration had taught him about projects that spanned seasons, buildings that served generations, and the deep satisfaction of work that outlasted the worker. More fundamentally, the 4 months in the wilderness had changed his understanding of what constituted a life well lived. The corporate world offered external validation and material comfort, but it also demanded sacrificing autonomy, creativity, and the connection to meaningful work that had become essential to his sense of purpose. That evening, Marcus drafted his response by the light of the oil lamp he'd crafted from salvaged materials. The letter was polite but definitive. He appreciated the offer, but had decided to pursue a different path entirely. He didn't elaborate on what that path might involve, partly because he wasn't entirely certain himself. What he did know was that the skills he'd developed during the restoration opened possibilities that hadn't existed 4 months earlier. Traditional building techniques were experiencing renewed interest among people seeking alternatives to industrial construction methods. Timber framing, stone masonry, And sustainable building practices were more than historical curiosities. They were marketable skills in a world increasingly concerned with environmental impact and authentic craftsmanship. More importantly, Marcus had discovered that he could create lasting value with his own hands, independent of corporate structures or digital platforms. The cabin would shelter future occupants regardless of stock market performance or technological disruption. Traditional skills transferred across cultures and generations in ways that software expertise never could. The job offer letter became kindling for his evening fire, curling into ash that rose through the chimney he'd built stone by stone. As the corporate promises disappeared in smoke and flame, Marcus felt the last ties to his former life dissolving as well. Outside, the forest settled into another night of patient growth and seasonal change. Inside, a man who had learned to build lasting things prepared for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead, confident that he now possessed tools, both physical and psychological, that would serve him regardless of what path he chose to follow. The morning of departure arrived with the kind of clarity that made every detail seem worth preserving in memory. Marcus moved through his final preparations with the deliberate care of someone who understood that endings, like beginnings, deserved proper attention. His first priority was ensuring the cabin would serve future visitors as generously as it had served him. The restoration had created more than personal shelter. It had renewed a resource that could provide refuge, inspiration, and practical lessons for anyone willing to make the journey into this remote corner of the wilderness. Marcus spent the morning organizing the tools and supplies he would leave behind. Reynolds' handplane, now seasoned by another craftsman's use, went into the cedar tool chest, along with the other implements that had made the restoration possible. Surplus lumber, carefully stacked and protected from weather, would provide materials for future repairs or improvements. Most importantly, he opened a new journal, leather-bound like Reynolds' original, but blank pages waiting for the next person's story. The first entry documented the restoration's completion date, the techniques used for major elements, and practical information about seasonal conditions, water sources, and material locations. But Marcus also included something Reynolds' journal had lacked: guidance for the psychological journey that accompanied traditional craftsmanship. Notes about the patience required for hand tool work, the satisfaction of creating lasting things, and the different relationship with time that made the effort worthwhile. "The forest teaches you to work at its pace," he wrote. "Fighting that rhythm leads to frustration and poor results. Accepting it leads to skills and satisfaction that no modern convenience can provide." The journal entries continued with practical advice about tool maintenance, seasonal work planning, and the importance of respecting both materials and traditional techniques. But running through all the technical information was a deeper message about the transformative power of meaningful work and the connection between craftsmanship and personal growth. Marcus also left detailed sketches of the restoration process, showing how damaged elements had been repaired or replaced. Future visitors would understand not just what had been accomplished, but how it had been done using hand tools and forest materials. The drawings became a form of instruction manual for anyone inspired to attempt similar projects. The supply cache grew throughout the morning as Marcus sorted through his accumulated materials. Basic tools, emergency supplies, first aid kit, and enough non-perishable food to sustain someone through unexpected weather delays. Everything organized and documented so that future visitors could take what they needed while contributing to the common resource. His final task was the most personally meaningful, adding his own mark to the cabin's permanent record. Following Reynolds' example, Marcus carved his initials and completion date into the beam above the front door. "Embassy 2024, restored with gratitude." Simple. Words that acknowledged both his own contribution and the debt he owed to the original builder whose vision had made the project possible. Standing in the completed cabin one last time, Marcus felt the weight of continuity and responsibility that came with contributing to something larger than individual achievement. This building would outlast both its original creator and its restorer, serving purposes and sheltering dreams that neither man could imagine. The new journal sat open on the pine table, its first entries complete, but most of its pages waiting for future stories. Someone would find this place as Marcus had found it, and face their own choice about whether to simply pass through or invest themselves in its continued story. As he shouldered his pack and prepared to close the door behind him, Marcus realized that leaving the journal represented more than practical consideration. For future visitors, it embodied his understanding that meaningful work creates responsibilities that extend beyond personal satisfaction. The restoration had taught him that traditional craftsmanship was never just about individual achievement. It was about participating in the continuous thread of knowledge and skill that connected generations of builders, each one learning from predecessors while contributing something new for successors. Walking away from the cabin, Marcus carried more than personal memories and newly acquired skills. He carried the obligation to share what he'd learned, to teach others about the satisfaction of creating lasting things, and to preserve traditional knowledge for future generations who might need alternatives to industrial methods and digital distractions. The journal would continue the story he'd begun, ensuring that the lessons learned during these 120 days would serve purposes he might never know about, but could trust would be worthwhile. 6 months after leaving the cabin, Marcus stood in the workshop he'd built behind his new home, holding the pocket watch his grandfather had given him 40 years earlier. The timepiece had traveled with him through college, career changes, and life transitions, but it had never felt more significant than it did in this moment. The workshop around him hummed with the quiet activity of traditional craftsmanship. Hand tools hung in careful arrangement on toolboards crafted from salvaged lumber. Works in progress occupied various stages of completion. A rocking chair commissioned by a young couple expecting their first child. A dining table being built for a family that wanted furniture their grandchildren could inherit. Window frames for a historic restoration. Project that valued authenticity over efficiency. Each project represented a client who had sought out Marcus specifically because of his commitment to traditional methods and lasting quality. Word had spread through networks of people who valued craftsmanship over convenience, permanence over profit margins. The demand for his work exceeded his capacity to supply it, a problem he solved by raising prices rather than rushing production. The pocket watch had become his most important tool, not for tracking billable hours or meeting deadlines, but for maintaining the proper relationship with time that quality work demanded. Its steady tick reminded him daily that some things couldn't be hurried, that patience was a prerequisite for excellence, and that the value of handmade objects lay partly in the time invested in their creation. Marcus opened the watch, reading again the inscription that had puzzled him for decades. Time teaches us what matters most. His grandfather had been a carpenter during an era when hand tools were necessity rather than choice, when building something to last was standard practice rather than luxury service. The old man had tried to pass along more than a timepiece. He'd attempted to share an understanding about the relationship between craftsmanship and time, between patience and satisfaction, between individual effort and lasting achievement. But those lessons had been incomprehensible to a young man, eager to embrace the speed and efficiency of the digital age. The cabin. Restoration had finally taught Marcus what his grandfather had been trying to communicate. Time wasn't a resource to be conserved or optimized. It was the essential ingredient that transformed raw materials into objects of lasting beauty and utility. Every minute spent in careful fitting, patient sanding, or precise adjustment added value that could never be replicated by mass production. The clients who commissioned his work understood this principle intuitively. They weren't paying for the fastest possible delivery or the cheapest available option. They were investing in objects that would improve with age, furniture that would develop character through use, and the satisfaction of owning things that had been made specifically for them, with attention to detail that honored both materials and purpose. Marcus had also discovered that traditional craftsmanship offered something the digital world couldn't provide: the ability to see his work's impact across generations. Software projects became obsolete within years, but the cabin he'd restored would shelter people for decades. The furniture he built would serve families through marriages, children, and grandchildren. His work would outlast his life, carrying forward the skills and values he'd learned to prize. The pocket watch had guided him through this transformation, its steady rhythm providing the patience that quality work demanded. When client deadlines pressed, when complex joints required multiple attempts, when perfectionism battled pragmatism, the watch reminded him that good work couldn't be rushed. Most importantly, the timepiece had taught him that his grandfather's greatest gift hadn't been the watch itself, but the values it represented. The old man had understood something about time, work, and satisfaction that took Marcus 40 years to appreciate. Traditional craftsmanship wasn't about nostalgia or romanticism. It was about creating value that transcended the immediate, connecting individual effort to lasting achievement. As evening settled over his workshop, Marcus closed the pocket watch and slipped it back into his vest pocket. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: wood that needed shaping, joints that demanded fitting, clients who trusted him to create objects worthy of their investment. But tonight, he felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned what his grandfather had been trying to teach: that time invested in meaningful work was never time wasted. The watch would continue ticking, measuring moments that added up to months, years, and decades of purposeful effort. And Marcus would continue building things designed to last, honoring both the materials that made them possible and the generations of craftsmen who had preserved the knowledge that made his work worthwhile.